Hear the word of the Lord from the book of Acts. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. And when they had entered the city, they went to the room upstairs where they were staying. Peter and John, and James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas son of James. All these were constantly devoting themselves to prayer, together with certain women, including Mary the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. In those days, Peter stood up among the brothers and sisters. Together, the crowd numbered about 120 persons. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly, from heaven, there came a sound like the rushing of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them. A tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every people under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them. "Fellow Jews and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say." This is the word of the Lord.
This morning we continue our series of messages based on our vision statement called "This Is Us." And that's what we're doing. There's an insert in your bulletin that highlights kind of the section of our document that we're drawing this message from. Now, last week, we heard a terrific sermon from Brendan taking us through the larger arc of Peter's life, the apostle. And he spoke of Peter's brokenness and the way in which God worked in his life, taking the broken pieces of his life to form something more beautiful. So to begin this morning, I would like us to engage together around the Apostle Peter's life. And some of you might be more familiar with his life or less familiar with his life. Some of you may have been here last week or not here. And so that being said, I'd love for us to turn in twos and threes and just take 2 or 3 minutes to talk about how do we relate to the Apostle Peter? How do we relate to the Apostle Peter? So, all right, let's turn where we are and talk about how we resonate with Peter's life. And for those of you online, feel free to just type in on the chat your thoughts about it. All right, let's regather. Peter is this complex figure. I think one of the beauties in Peter's life is that one, it's very public. And it allows us an access to his life, to his strengths and his weaknesses, to his successes and his failures. And we can find company in his story, in sort of the length and breadth of his story. Something caught my attention. I don't know if many of you follow the NBA, but recently the Minnesota Timberwolves got run over by the train called Oklahoma City Thunder. And it seemed inevitable to some that Oklahoma City will win the title, but since I wrote this initial line, I don't think we're ready to let the ink dry on that one just yet. But what caught my attention was Anthony Edwards of the Timberwolves said this, still stinging from the loss to the Oklahoma City Thunder. He said, "No one will outwork me this offseason. No one will outwork me this offseason." It's interesting how losing and failing in a respect can be a powerful motivator. We want to change the narrative. We want to rewrite the script. And sometimes we need this kind of motivation. We need disappointment in order to perhaps dig deeper and be more disciplined. And anyway, this actually brought to mind something from my youth. I couldn't remember exactly when I wrote this statement down. It might have been in my later high school years or into college, but for some reason, it came back to mind this week as I was preparing, and it was this statement: "I will do today what others won't, so I can do tomorrow what others can't." And I already forgot this here. All right, there's the Apostle Peter. "I will do today what others won't, so I can do tomorrow what others can't." And for some reason it came back to mind, and I thought to myself, wow, like that was so original. Like, wow, that was like so profound. So, not trusting in my own humility, I decided to Google that statement, because you can Google pretty much anything you want to, and I realized that this statement originated with whom? Anyone know? Not Peter, but our very own Jerry Rice of the 49ers. I thought, I was so disappointed that I didn't come up with this. I'm like, Jerry Rice, who is he? Anyway. And it's interesting because I look back and I tried to sort of understand kind of my consciousness. Like, why did I write that down? Like, I remember it. I can almost see it on a Post-it. So much of my life is on Post-its. It was on a Post-it, taped to, I don't know, my desk or whatever, and it was just this daily reminder that I was going to live in a way that helped create my future. But there's also, I don't know, I was trying to think, wow, was there some competitiveness in my thinking? Was there a way in which I was comparing myself to other people? I'm going to work harder. I'm going to do better. No one's going to outwork me this off season. And there's a way in which, as I thought about this quote, I thought, oh, Peter might have said that. Nobody is going to outwork me. No one's going to speak before me. You know, no one's going to step out on the water before me. Anyway, so we find some company in the Apostle Peter. And I'd like us to, there we are. We already did that. We already did that. And here we are. I want to talk for a moment about some catalytic moments of self-awareness in the life of Peter. Brendan talked about some of these last week. Peter's first encounter with Jesus. What's going on here? Peter's first encounter with Jesus occurs when Jesus preached from Peter's boat. And then Jesus tells Peter to push out into the lake and cast their nets. And Peter points out to the novice fisherman Jesus that they had fished all night and didn't catch anything. But Jesus seemed to have this divine fish locator. And sure enough, Peter hauls in this massive amount of fish. And then Peter, feeling overwhelmed, kneels down in this flapping cacophony of fish all around him and begs Jesus to go away from him. Peter, in this moment, felt this humbling unworthiness. But Jesus won't abandon Peter. Jesus won't abandon Peter. Now, Peter was used to being the man. He always wanted to be the man. He wanted to be the first to raise his hand, the one who worked harder. But in this moment, that wasn't working for him. Our next encounter occurs when Jesus comes walking on the water. And Peter is stunned by what he sees, and he asks Jesus to join him on the water. That would be all of our reaction in a moment like that. And Peter asks this of Jesus before his mind registers the gravity of the situation. So out he goes on the water until reality floods him with fear, and he cries, "Lifeguard!" Next up, Jesus is sharing with his disciples the rumors that are circulating about his identity. And he asks them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter blurts out, "You are the Son of God, the Messiah." And we hear the sound, ding, ding, ding. And Jesus is delighted, and Peter brushes himself off, I imagine, and then he holsters his imaginary apostle gun. He's like, "One more right answer for me, boys. Try to keep up." And finally, the last scene that we'll talk about comes from the last week of Jesus' life, when Jesus prophesies that his disciples will all scatter under pressure. And Peter's like, "Hold on a second, Jesus. Hold on a second. I can understand you looking at these guys and thinking they're going to crumble under pressure. But let me remind you, I am the rock on which you're going to build your church. I will be the last man standing. Don't you worry, Jesus, I'm with you." And we know how this story unfolds. This is my image of Peter. Now, there's a way in which, as Peter's grown up, and we all grow up with strengths and a sense of our identity, and hopefully we're forming some confidence in which to live in the world, and we're discovering things about our gifts. But there's also ways in which we can develop sort of distortions, ways in which we perhaps see each other, ways in which we are compensating for something. Perhaps we have a need in our life that we are trying to overcome. And I want us to just peer into the life of Peter and to look at maybe some ways in which this distortion had formed. You see, it wasn't enough for Peter to be in the inner circle. So like you think of it, he was part of the 12. I mean, Jesus chose just 12, and you're part of the 12, but that wasn't good enough. And furthermore, Peter was part of the inner circle with James and John, but I don't think that was quite good enough for Peter. There was a part of him that wanted to be the one who always took the last shot, right? Now, the truth is, not everyone wants to take the last shot. Not everyone has it within them to hold that kind of pressure, to be in the moment and yet sort of have this inner calm and resolve. And it helps to actually be able to shoot if you're going to do this. You know, not everyone is a Tyrese Halliburton of the Indiana Pacers who doesn't seem to have the problem taking the last shot. He seems to anticipate that this is going to work out for me. So I want to admit that not everyone sort of has that same drive. And so I look at Peter and I admire his spirit, his courage, his willingness sometimes just to say what needs saying. Maybe it's the New Yorker in me that appreciates people being a little bit more direct. I don't know, perhaps. But there's a way in which Peter has some of this spirit. It does take something in order to take risks. But there's also a way in which Peter lived off of comparison. And there is a way in which competition was kind of a threat to his identity. And so there's a way in which he wanted to win. He wanted to win. Now, the purpose of achievement is not just that we get to stand in the limelight or get the golden buzzer or we get to, do our favorite dance before we spike the ball. There is something bigger. There is something bigger to anything that we engage in and anything that we accomplish. There needs to be a sense of the greater good. You see, courage is a different thing when what we have in mind is the service of other people. And Peter was slowly learning these lessons, and this was gradually being formed in him. Brendan pointed out last week that Peter needed moments of brokenness in order to open him up to something more. He needed to sink in the water after walking on it. He needed to be rebuked as well as affirmed. He needed to be humbled in order to learn how to hold the things that he knew about Jesus. And his denials of knowing Jesus helped him to realize he was more vulnerable and he was more like everyone else. What does Jesus want for Peter? I want to be clear that in these moments where Jesus is confrontational with Peter, Jesus was not trying to humiliate Peter or to prove to Peter that he was unworthy like everyone else, but Jesus just wanted for Peter to have a truer picture of himself. He wanted him to understand that superiority to others is not leadership. He desired a sense for Peter of self-awareness, that he would understand his limitations. He hoped for Peter to become more compassionate, developing a capacity to understand what others feel. He wanted Peter to possess courage, born out of seeing that what God was capable of doing in him and with him, and sometimes in spite of him. These external events were meant to accomplish an internal work in Peter's life. And there are ways in which God's desire was for these events in his life, these setbacks, these failures, to shape him ultimately in a positive way. Richard Rohr contends that this kind of failing or falling is a natural part of the human journey and a crucial stage of spiritual development. Rohr suggests that we can't fully appreciate the upside of spiritual growth without experiencing the downside of challenges in life. I'm still figuring this thing out. Beyond failure. Last week, Brendan highlighted the scene at the lake after the resurrection. Peter and the gang had gone fishing. And what do you do when your discipleship gig, the wheels come off? Well, you go back to something that you're more familiar with, that you've had some success with. And your hope in those moments is to kind of put your life back together a little bit. So Peter thinking, okay, I've just failed miserably. Hey guys, let's go fishing. I know how to do that. And so they go out fishing. And then Jesus shows up and lights a fire on the beach. And of course, Peter and the guys are struggling, and they're not catching anything because Peter needs another one of these moments, kind of a deja vu event, in order to go, oh my gosh, yes, that's right. I do feel powerless. I am struggling. I can't do this on my own. And so Jesus, it's just very interesting, the language. So Jesus is on the beach, and they don't know it's Jesus. And they're out there fishing, and it's not working. And they're looking around at the boat, and there's no fish in the boat, and they're struggling, and their arms are tired, and they're sleep deprived, and what have you. And some guy on the shore, some guy who's not even wet, is calling out to them on the boat. And I think too, the way I'm just thinking to myself, when we're at the cottage on the lake, people sometimes have conversations, maybe on a dock that's like across the lake, and you can hear it. You can hear what they're saying. And so like when Jesus calls to these guys and the sound travels across the lake, who knows what other fishermen are out there fishing, and anyway. But Jesus says, children, have you no fish? Looking around going, like, who's this guy? Who's this guy? Someone drag him in the water. And so they humor him or whatever, and they're like, no, we haven't caught anything. And he's like, cast the net to the right side of the boat. Interesting. We've heard this before. And so they do. They're like, maybe this guy's just going to keep saying stuff until we do, so let's just cast the net on the right side of the boat. And suddenly they haul in this incredible amount of fish, which is amazing because that means they're going to eat. And then John, who's so humble in writing his gospel, this is how it reads: the disciple whom Jesus loved turned to Peter. Just like, why does he call himself that? The disciple whom Jesus loved. So maybe John had similar issues to Peter. But he turns to Peter, and he says to Peter, it's the Lord. Slaps him up the backside of the head, and he goes, it's the Lord. So Peter, who was wearing who knows what, it says anyway that he put on his outer garment. Hopefully there was an undergarment. And anyway, he jumps into the water because that's what you do. And he wades into the water. And I love what Richard Rohr says. He says, one of the great surprises is that human beings come to full consciousness when we face our own contradictions. When we face those moments where what we have claimed about ourselves, or what we hoped was true about ourselves, or the way in which we've been trying to put our life together isn't quite working. And I don't think God's ultimate objective is for us to just be like, there's nothing good about me, and I'm totally unworthy, and I'm totally incompetent. That's not it. God just wants us to see ourselves clearly, because that is the doorway to growing and becoming ultimately who we are meant to be. And so Rohr says, one of the great surprises is that human beings come to full consciousness when facing their own contradictions and choosing to make friends with their own mistakes and failings. That's really interesting. So when I fail, when I make a mistake, and I want to hide, and I want to armor up, and I want to blame, and all the things that are in my toolbox to handle my own insufficiency. But see, when I can take a deep breath and say, this is actually telling me something about myself, and I have an opportunity to grow as a result of this uncomfortable place that I find myself in. Back to our story. Interesting thing is, when the disciples pull the net up onto the beach, Jesus has already got fish on the fire. I don't know if you've caught that before. He's already got fish on the fire. He knows how to do this fishing business. But it made me wonder, sorry, this is a total tangent in my mind. Sometimes I'm reading these stories, I'm like, how did Jesus get this fish? Did he come with like line and hook and bait? Like, I don't know. Or did he just say fish and they jumped onto the beach and thank you very much for being of service. Anyway, so at the end of breakfast, and I'm sure there's some tension, Peter's initially like really excited to see Jesus and then like really uncomfortable to see Jesus because they have this thing that's happened between them, which looks like I've denied knowing you 3 times. So now we're having breakfast, and I don't know if any of you have ever had an uncomfortable moment around the dinner table with your family? No one? Anyone? So definitely in my household, with 4 brothers, there were lots of uncomfortable moments. Anyway, they eat because they need to eat, and Peter needs to be able to think clearly. But Jesus says something very interesting to Peter in the first of 3 questions to Peter. But I want us to hear this very first question very clearly. He says to Peter, "Do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus says to him, "Feed my lambs." Now, what does Jesus mean? Do you love me more than these? Is Jesus saying, do you love me more than the fish? Do you love me more than you love your friends? Or is Jesus asking, is your love for me greater than theirs? Is that how you see yourself? Is your love greater than theirs? What is Jesus' invitation to Peter? And I think it's the invitation to us. First of all, we're invited to live beyond comparison and into community. beyond comparison and into community. We are invited, yes, to be strong, but acknowledge when we need help. We are called to be ourselves, to be authentic. So we're not striving to be someone else. There's not like a mold that we're trying to fit into. All right, and the font will get smaller. Strain your eyes. Number 4, we're called to live beyond hiding and into resiliency. Peter could easily have just wanted to hide. And maybe that's what fishing was for him. Maybe fishing for Peter was his go-to accessible mode of hiding. But Jesus shows up there. Jesus always wants to show up when we are hiding, when we are stuck in patterns of not facing ourselves. And lastly, we are invited to be the gaze of God, not the glare of God, as Richard Rohr would say. Now, what does this mean? All of us encounters moments of failing, setbacks, and with each other, like what do we do? So the invitation here for us is not to hide, not to be reactive, not to blame. But for each other, how do we help each other? How do we help each other be the invitation of Jesus? And that is by mirroring, as Jesus does for Peter, mirroring the love of God. So Jesus shows up at the shoreline, not just for Peter to make things right, but for Peter to witness how God sees him in these moments of failure. And we need each other to mirror this kind of love, this kind of acceptance, this kind of reconciliation. So we are invited to be the gaze of God, not the glare of God. See, normally, when we've blown it with someone, do we want to look at them? Do we want to experience their disapproval? I don't think so. Anyway, so this journey that Peter is on, right? God has in mind something for Peter. He sees him with love. He sees him with potential. He sees him with strengths. But he also sees him with these parts of himself that need to be healed. So we return to our text in the book of Acts. Eventually, we were going to get to the day of Pentecost. So we return to our text in the book of Acts, and the Spirit has been poured out. And these Galileans are a walking United Nations linguistic convention. Suddenly, these Galileans, maybe they spoke Aramaic, maybe they spoke some Hebrew or some Greek, but suddenly they're speaking languages that they never learned. And it is stunning to these onlookers. So on this day of Pentecost, which is this huge feast in the Jewish culture, you have people from all over the world who speak different languages. And they are hearing these prophetic words coming out of the mouths of locals, unlearned men, in their own language. And it's this beautiful thing. It's this beautiful thing. But I want us to just lean in and pay attention to how Luke writes about this moment in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 1, which Kathy read, there's this sentence. In those days, Peter stood up among the believers. I want us to hear this. Peter stood up among the believers. In chapter 2, this is after the Spirit was poured out. Luke, the writer, says this. Then Peter stood up with the 11. And I don't think this is accidental. I think it represents a different posture for Peter. That he now sees himself among the disciples. That he's now with the 11, not standing aside, not standing above, not wanting to be, having to be the spokesperson. Now he is with them, he is among them, and this is a different way for Peter. And now Peter is able to bring his gifts, his strengths, his courage, because his sense of connection to the disciples of Jesus has undergone a transformation. The way that he wore his leadership mantle had changed. And the beauty is that the community received him. They saw Peter for his rich gifts and courage. But there's a way in which Peter needed to go on this journey of relinquishing the need to be better, to be the first to speak, to succeed when others failed, to have the right answers. And so for Peter, going on this journey of failure and humility and receiving the restoring love of Jesus has transformed him. And the way he sees himself is not distinct from, but as belonging to these followers. You see, the work of the Spirit is not just an us experience. It ripples outward and is seeking to restore us to connection with one another. It's altering the way that we see each other, we see ourselves, but also the way that we see each other. You see, the gaze of God enlarges our ability to receive the rich diversity that comes from Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So as we close, I want to give us another opportunity to talk with one another. I have a question here for us. I'd love for us to take the next few minutes to talk amongst ourselves about this. Over the last couple of weeks, we've walked through Peter's life. We've seen how Peter's growth went through a pathway of brokenness that eventually formed beauty in his life. So I want us to take a few minutes while we have this beautiful soundtrack of music playing for us to talk amongst ourselves about this. As we look at our own lives, and we're invited to be as vulnerable as we want to be, but can we talk for a few minutes sort of mirroring Peter's life, how have setbacks and failures in our lives actually been catalysts for growing? You follow me? Can we take a few minutes, just amongst ourselves, turn where you are, and to talk with each other as our way of responding to the message about, as we look at our lives, are there ways in which, looking back, that we see moments where we failed, where we've had setbacks, disappointments, and how they have contributed to us growing and becoming more whole people, okay? Let's take the next few minutes to do that with each other. All right.